Did you know that over 1,600 people have mysteriously vanished from national parks across the United States? The wilderness is a place of beauty and serenity, but also of countless unsolved disappearances and mysteries. The stories you're about to hear might make you rethink your next trip into the woods. Out in the wild, far from the safety of city streets, lies a world that can turn from peaceful to terrifying in an instant. Tonight, we'll share real-life stories of campers and hikers who encountered things they couldn't explain, experiences that turned a weekend escape into their worst nightmare. You'll soon understand why the woods aren't as safe as they seem. The deep woods have an undeniable allure. Vast, quiet, a perfect place to disconnect from the hustle and bustle. But once you're out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of your own breathing, the isolation can become suffocating. When the sun goes down, your mind starts to play tricks on you, and every shadow seems alive. What happens when those tricks aren't just in your head? When you hear something that shouldn't be there, or you sense someone watching you? These true stories will show you how a peaceful night under the stars can quickly turn into a haunting experience you'll never forget. From eerie sounds that have no source to encounters with strangers who don't belong, the following stories come from people who sought adventure in the great outdoors, but returned with memories that would haunt them forever. Let's dive into these unsettling tales. Tales of fear, confusion, and the unknown. Story 1. The Lost Village in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I was working as a park ranger at Blackwater Falls State Park in West Virginia when I encountered something that still haunts me. It was late autumn, and the park was mostly empty. One evening, I was making my rounds when I noticed an old, overgrown trail that wasn't on any of our maps. Curious, I decided to follow it. The deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to close in on me. The air grew heavy, and the sounds of the forest faded away until all I could hear was my own breathing. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon what appeared to be the remnants of an old village. The buildings were in ruins, covered in moss and vines, but there was something odd about them. They weren't built in any style I recognized. As I explored further, I found a small cemetery. The graves were unmarked, just stone slabs sticking out of the ground. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, like I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard the faint sound of children laughing, but there was no one around. I ran out of there as fast as I could. I later learned that there were no records of any village ever existing in that part of the park. To this day, I avoid that trail and warn visitors to stay away from it. Story 2. The Vanishing Light in Olympic National Park, Washington. While working the night shift at Olympic National Park, Washington, I often encountered strange things, but one night stands out above the rest. I was patrolling the outskirts of the park near Lake Crescent when I saw a light flickering in the distance, deep within the forest. It was odd because the area was off-limits to campers due to recent bear activity. Thinking it might be someone in trouble, I headed towards the light. As I got closer, the light seemed to move deeper into the forest, always staying just out of reach. I called out, but there was no response. I continued following it, but something felt wrong, like I was being lured. The forest grew darker and more oppressive, and a sense of dread settled over me. Finally, the light disappeared altogether, and I was left standing in the pitch-black woods, completely disoriented. My radio had lost signal, and I had no idea how far I had wandered. I eventually made my way back to the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I got back to the station, I found out that several other rangers had reported seeing the same light over the years, but no one had ever been able to explain it. The locals believe it's a spirit, luring people deeper into the forest, never to return. Story 3. The Disappearing Hiker in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. During a particularly foggy morning at Shenandoah National Park, Virginia, I received a distress call about a missing hiker near Old Rag Mountain. I was part of the search team that went out to find him. The hiker was an experienced outdoorsman, so it was strange that he would have gotten lost on such a well-marked trail. As we hiked up the mountain, the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to just a few feet. We split up to cover more ground, and that's when I saw him. A man standing just off the trail, facing away from me. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. As I approached, he suddenly stepped into the fog and disappeared. I ran to where I had seen him, but there was no sign of anyone. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We searched the area thoroughly, but we never found any trace of the hiker. The fog eventually lifted, but the eerie feeling remained. Some of the older rangers whispered about the mountain being cursed, that people who get lost in the fog are never found. Story 4. The Watcher in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. In the summer of 2015, I was stationed at Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. I was patrolling one of the less traveled trails near Clingman's Dome when I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It felt like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I continued down the trail, but the feeling only intensified. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows between the trees. It was tall, much taller than any person, and its limbs were unnaturally long. I froze, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the figure, and as I did, it seemed to fade into the shadows. I turned and ran back to the ranger station. I reported what I saw, but no one believed me. They said it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I refuse to go back to that part of the park. Story 5. The Whispering Woods in Yosemite National Park, California. One night, while patrolling the backcountry of Yosemite National Park, California, I came across a campsite that wasn't on our records. It looked abandoned, with the remains of a fire pit and some old camping gear scattered around. As I was checking it out, I started hearing whispers coming from the trees around me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder and more distinct. They were voices, many voices, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The air around me grew cold, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were coming from all directions, and I felt completely surrounded. I tried to call for backup, but my radio was dead. That's when I saw shadows moving between the trees, darting in and out of my peripheral vision. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods, but there was nothing there. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving an eerie silence. I got out of there as fast as I could. When I reported the incident, the other rangers just looked at me with pity. They said the backcountry was full of strange stories, and that the whispers were just the spirits of the forest, reminding us of their presence. Story 6. The Forgotten Trail in Grand Teton National Park, Wyoming. I had been working as a ranger in Grand Teton National Park for about 3 years when I encountered something truly unsettling. It was early spring, and the snow had just begun to melt, revealing the trails that had been buried all winter. I was assigned to survey a lesser-known trail, one that hadn't been used much in recent years. The trail started off normal enough, but after a few miles, I noticed it wasn't on my map. The path was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and brambles, but I could see faint boot prints leading further in. I felt a strange pull to keep going, as if something was guiding me. After about an hour of walking, I found myself at a small clearing. There, I saw an old, weathered cabin, something that shouldn't have been there. The structure looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned for decades, but there were signs of recent activity. A smoldering fire pit, fresh wood stacked by the door. As I approached the cabin, a sense of dread washed over me. I knocked on the door, and when no one answered, I decided to peek inside. The air inside was thick and stale, and the place was filled with old, dusty furniture. But what caught my eye was the large map on the wall. It was of the park, but it was different, showing trails and locations I had never seen before. And on the map, the cabin was marked with a red X. Suddenly, I heard the floorboards creak behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I bolted out of the cabin and didn't stop running until I was back on the main trail. When I reported the cabin, no one could find any record of it existing. I went back the next day with a team, but the trail I had followed was gone, as if it had never been there. Story 7. The Silent Forest in Acadia National Park, Maine. One crisp autumn evening, I was patrolling the dense woods of Acadia National Park. The park was known for its vibrant fall colors, but as night fell, the forest took on a different, more sinister feel. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an unnerving silence. As I made my way through the trees, I came across a small group of campers who seemed visibly shaken. They claimed to have heard strange, unexplainable noises, voices whispering their names, but no one was around. One of them mentioned seeing shadowy figures flitting between the trees, always just out of sight. Skeptical but concerned, I decided to stay with him for a while, setting up my tent nearby. That night, as I lay in my tent, I started to hear it too. Whispers carried on the wind, indistinct and distant, but unmistakably human. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it could be the wind or an echo from somewhere in the park. But then, I saw the shadows. Dark, human-like forms moved through the trees, always staying at the edge of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods, but the shadows vanished as soon as the light touched them. The campers and I huddled by the fire, too terrified to sleep. At dawn, the shadows and whispers were gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest. We packed up and left immediately. I never told anyone about what happened that night, and I haven't returned to that part of the park since. Story 8. The Haunting at Big Bend National Park, Texas. It was a sweltering summer day in Big Bend National Park, Texas, when I was called to investigate a series of strange occurrences near the Rio Grande. Visitors had reported hearing crying and seeing ghostly apparitions along a secluded section of the riverbank. I arrived at the site in the early evening, just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was thick with heat, and the river flowed sluggishly, casting long shadows on the shore. As I walked along the bank, I began to hear it, a faint, sorrowful wail carried on the wind. The cries seemed to come from a bend in the river where the water was deeper and darker. I followed the sound until I reached an old, twisted tree that leaned over the water. Beneath its gnarled branches, I saw a figure, an ethereal woman, her clothes dripping with water, her face twisted in anguish. She was reaching out towards the river, as if searching for something. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure suddenly turned and looked directly at me, her eyes empty and hollow. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she dissolved into the mist rising from the water. Shaken, I reported the incident, but the locals weren't surprised. They spoke of a legend about a woman who drowned in the river long ago, cursed to wander the banks in search of her lost child. They called her La Llorona, and I realized that I had encountered the ghostly figure from the old tales. Story 9. The Shadow Man in Mount Rainier National Park, Washington. I had just started my shift at Mount Rainier National Park when I got a call about a missing hiker on the Wonderland Trail. The trail circles the entire park, and it's known for its rugged terrain. A solo hiker had gone off the trail and hadn't been heard from in over 24 hours. I joined the search party, and we fanned out into the woods, calling the hiker's name. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and a thick fog began to roll in, making visibility almost impossible. We split up into pairs to cover more ground, and I ended up with a veteran ranger who had worked the park for over 20 years. As we trudged through the fog, my partner suddenly stopped. He pointed ahead, and I saw it too, a dark figure standing perfectly still in the distance. We called out, thinking it was the hiker, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching us. We moved closer, but as we approached, the figure seemed to dissolve into the fog. My partner went pale and whispered, "It's him." Confused, I asked what he meant, and he told me about the Shadow Man, a figure that had been seen by rangers and hikers for decades, always appearing before someone goes missing. We searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of the hiker. Days later, his body was discovered miles away, far off the trail, with no apparent cause of death. The Shadow Man was never seen again, but the image of that dark figure haunts me to this day. Last story. The abandoned campsite in Denali National Park, Alaska. During a routine patrol in Denali National Park, Alaska, I came across an abandoned campsite deep in the wilderness, far from any established trails. The tent was still set up, the campfire cold, and there were personal belongings scattered around, but no sign of the campers. What struck me as odd was how everything was left behind, as if the people had just walked away. There were even half-eaten meals on the picnic table, untouched. I radioed in to report the find, and we organized a search of the area. As night fell, I decided to stay at the campsite, hoping the campers might return. I settled in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside my tent. I unzipped the flap and shined my flashlight outside, but no one was there. Then I noticed something truly unsettling: new footprints in the snow, leading away from the campsite into the dark woods. They weren't there when I arrived, and they weren't mine. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared at the edge of the tree line. The search continued for days, but the campers were never found. The locals told me stories about a creature they called the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that preys on lost travelers in the wilderness. I don't know if I believe in such things, but I do know that the eerie silence and those footprints will stay with me forever. As we've journeyed through these tales of terror from the remote corners of some of the most iconic national parks, it's clear that the wilderness holds secrets far darker than we can imagine. From eerie, forgotten trails to ghostly apparitions, the fear that these stories evoke is deeply rooted in the unknown and the unexplained. Each of these experiences leaves us with a lingering sense of dread, a reminder that even in the most beautiful landscapes, something sinister might be lurking just beyond the trees. These stories remind us of the fine line between the natural and the supernatural, and how quickly that line can blur when we're alone in the vast wilderness. For those who venture into the deep woods, these tales serve as a warning. Sometimes, it's not just the wildlife you need to be wary of. If these stories send a chill down your spine, imagine what might happen if you shared your own. Have you experienced something eerie in the great outdoors? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales from the shadows of the wilderness. Who knows what might be lurking in the next story?